Hey, welcome to Strategy Shorts episode 10, the best defense. Today I'm going to talk about why basically any deck in Duelist that uses minions should be prepared to get aggressive, contest board early on, and push your opponent into the far corner. So, caveats as necessary. This applies, I think, very, very strongly to Gauntlet and slightly less strongly to Constructed. Some Constructed decks don't rely on minions at all, and some of them want to hide as much as they can, like Mantra, for instance, Archetypes, where you run away and set up all on the other side of the board. This is specifically for when your deck's game plan involves minions in some way, whether it's because you're going to try and combo with them, like you're playing Divine Bond, you're going to use them just to get value and kill stuff, like Lava Slasher, you're playing a mid-range deck, aggro, tempo, anything like that. But even if you're playing the most controlling of, late game Lionel decks, Magma decks, even some Vanor decks, like Arcanist Vanor for instance, your strategy and your cards will still be more effective if you take the fight to your opponent rather than trying to hide in the back. Why is this? So, because of Duelist's positional quality, there's a requirement that in order to use a minion, it has to be in range to attack. That sounds kind of dumb. That's why I thought about how to phrase it in a way that didn't sound kind of dumb. But what I mean by that is, if you want to get value out of something, right? I've got my Lava Slasher. It has to be in range to be able to stand next to something. That's not a massive ask, right? That's pretty easy. If I want to play like a Thunderhorn, it has to be in range to move and attack something next turn, and attack a relevant target after my opponent has had a turn to do something about it. Now, they might just kill the Thunderhorn. That's fine. That often doesn't rely on positioning. Sometimes it does. But they can also always just run away from it. If we're standing on my side of the board, right? If my back's against the wall, I don't have very many places I can put my Thunderhorn, or my Lava Slasher, or my Deoltas, or my 2-drop, anything. Which means one of two things. Which means two things, sorry. One, my opponent can run away from it much more easily, because they have this big space, and a lot of choices about where to put their units, where to body block, where to move to. And B, I don't have very many options for where to put it myself. So I am going to struggle to body block it. I'm going to struggle to use it to body block me. I'm going to struggle to defend it from my opponent's attacks, put it out the way, or even play around AoE by spreading out. All of those options are limited for me. If we're fighting on my opponent's side of the board, they're close to the wall, then I have all the luxuries they had, and they are as restrained as I was in the previous example. So if I'm backing my opponent up into their side of the board and reducing their options for moving away from my minions, positioning their minions defensively, spreading out to play around areas of effect, and trying to set up good trades on my minions without getting their stuff killed for free. So even though I might be playing a really slow control deck and they might be playing an aggressive deck, my minions, by virtue of being minions that have a positional mechanic inherent to them on the board, are better when I'm playing aggressively, because it means that I have more space. I control more space. In general, I think the concept of territory and territory control is very underrated in Duelist. Like, you get a lot of value out of just being on your opponent's side of the table. Because that means you have access to more space that is essentially uncontested, right? They're sort of backed into their half, and you've got the rest of their half plus your entire half as like room you can run away in, places where you can, hide ranged units or retreat to in a few turns if your opponent starts taking the board in their favor. So you have multiple turns of grace where you can like run away and body block before your opponent can trap you. Whereas if you start off by retreating and letting them come to you, unless you have a specific plan in mind, like a specific counterattack, you're going to be able to swing the momentum back around, turn 3, turn 4, and you're willing to accept the positional penalty for that, you're going to really struggle. It's very difficult to decide, I'm going to back off to let my opponent walk into my trap or whatever, and then, maybe your opponent pulls ahead and you're like, well, I need to run away now, but I've got nowhere to run to. Whereas if you push into their half, you pressure them, and you try and take board, take territory, maintain tempo. Now, if your opponent does something scary and you need to run off, your life total starts getting low, anything like that, you can just back off, and you've got several turns worth of space that you can run through while you're doing that, buying you time to find the cards you need to save yourself. Find healing, find removal, find whatever. Big blockers, find a combo piece. You basically get several free additional turns of not dying because you played aggressively in the early game. And so any deck can benefit from having a positional advantage, especially early on, but basically at any point, like regardless of what strategy you're playing, because it makes it so much easier to dictate how minions trade. It makes it so much easier to defend yourself, so much easier to run away. And similarly, if you're on the back foot, if you're trapped into a corner, it makes it so much harder to do all of those things. It makes it much less likely that you're going to be able to just play a minion and have it not die. It makes it much less likely that you're going to be able to ensure you don't get hit next turn. Because you don't have that many options, and the walls are a massive constraint. So, what now? What do we do with this information? We can start by looking at some of the more successful decks from Duelist's, let's say, recent history. Right up until the recent patch, from a couple of weeks ago now, we had this Magmar deck dominating the ladder. It was comprised of high-value removal spells, powerful finishers like Soaring Finality, but also it had a bunch of random creatures in it, right? We had Golem, Metallurgist, and Cryptographer, a 2/3 for 2 and a 2/2 for 2, not typically control cards. We had Ragebinder, a great card, but it's a 3/4, like it doesn't massively, like it's not a removal spell, it doesn't always 2 for 1, it's not too hard to answer. Like, what if you draw that when you need to get rid of an Imara healer? It does nothing, right? Some people are playing Young Silithar, I think, instead of Cryptographer. Same as Ragebinder, but it's smaller. Like, why would you want that? And then, of course, you have your Lava Slasher, and people played, like, there was usually a 4-drop. Some people played Tegete or Sunsteel, things like that. And then Macanto at the top end. Why play these at all, right? Why, if you're playing this control deck where you're just going to kill all their stuff and then cast Soaring Finality and win the game, why bother? Well, it turns out that minions can also be removal. They're removal that you can play proactively. You know, I can put my Ragebinder down and then try and trade with it next turn. They help take board. So they help you exert a presence on the board and restrict your opponent's options. Help you apply pressure to them, which then allow you to use the minions that you've applied this pressure with to make good trades. So if I can have a decent guarantee that I'm going to be ahead positionally, then I can put all these minions suddenly become removal spells, right? Ragebinder becomes a Phoenix Fire that doesn't die, because if I'm highly likely to be able to attack something good with it next turn, or at least use it to force my opponent further into the corner, then it's not dissimilar to putting a Phoenix Fire in my deck, except I can play it when my opponent doesn't have a good target, if that makes sense. So I can still use a mid-range card or an aggro card to get results in a control deck, because as long as I can set those minions up to actually be effective, they become very high value cards. And a well-placed Ragebinder is, often as good as a homeostatic Rebuke would be, because it can sit there eating 2-drops all day. And then similarly in this deck, like, you don't run that many minions, so your early game is not that consistent, but you had stuff like Rebuke and Macanto later on to swing that the other way. And of course, the other reason to play all this stuff is that setting up an early Lava Slasher is really, really powerful. And the best way to do that is with other minions that can take mana tiles and reduces cost, as well as, of course, Flash Reincarnation. With Lava Slasher now being a 4/7, this effect will be a bit less pronounced, but it'll still be strong. Like, Lava Slasher on turn 2 will still be great, because that Lava Slasher, it traded with your opponent's unit and left a 4/4 behind, or whatever, some size of creature. 4/5 maybe, like even the nerfed version can eat a 2-drop and still be a 4/5. That's ridiculous. And your opponent has to kill that. And either they take a bunch of face damage, which helps you burst them down later, or they let it trade with more minions. And so your Lava Slasher is a 5-mana removal spell that then gives you another 0-mana removal spell the next turn, or a bunch of face pressure. And either way, like, your opponent can run away from it to avoid it, but if you're ahead, if you're backing them into the corner, now they're just going to have to take their lumps from this giant chunk of golem that's already killed something and is going to do more. So you can take a control deck, or a mid-range, a mid-range verging on control deck, and make it play more aggressively, and in doing so, make it way more powerful and faster, and increase its variety of tools. Because, like, you can't, especially in Duelists, you can't really make a deck that is literally just like, 35 removal spells and a few win conditions, because your removal spells won't always line up right. There are cards that are good against removal spells that your opponent will be able to eke out incremental value with. There are cards that just, don't really die in a productive fashion, stuff like Sarlacc. Artifacts, you can't feasibly answer everything. Whereas minions let you answer other minions, pressure your opponent's face, chip off artifacts, eat up their removal, which eats up their mana, which buys you time. And on top of all that, helps you exert strategic pressure, where you push into their territory, try and wall off the board, try and wall off their options, and it all kind of feeds back into itself. This kind of sounds like I'm trying to argue that, tempo-heavy, minion-based decks are how you should play Duelist. And to an extent, I think that's actually true. Outside of, outliers like Mantra, which is a very, very specific deck, the majority of successful Duelist decks have a pretty strong tempo component to them. Either, they are just tempo decks, like old Tempo Arjun. It's very, very powerful. They are tempo decks disguised as control decks, like this Magma deck was. They're tempo decks disguised as mid-range decks, like Arcanist Fae, which, you can sit there and grind resources with giant Arcanists, but, like, people were bringing in Hailstone Prison for the mirror, because bouncing an Albeast Sage and attacking with your own and developing another Arcanist or drawing extra cards was, like, just a huge deal. Because if you stick an Albeast Sage, it generates an insane amount of tempo, because it can just keep trading, and it bestows this power on all your Arcanists, because it keeps healing itself for you. And you can use the removal spells that you're playing to buff your Albeast to deal with anything larger. So, even though it was kind of a mid-range deck with a controlling slant, like often you'd have Enfeeble combo in there to clear things, especially before Enfeeble got nerfed. You'd have Meltdown there as a finisher. But despite all that, one of the most effective things the deck could do was just curve out, like a tempo deck. You curve Circulus into Albeast, into spells, into Blue Conjurer, into spells, and you just run over your opponent with massive Arcanists while killing their stuff. And a control deck focused more on spells wouldn't be able to do that. So unless your control deck has a combo finish, say like Wolfey, it's very difficult to play efficiently without minions. If you're trying to win with just like normal minions, like big bombs in the late game, and your early game is removal and draw, you'll fall so far behind on board, your bombs just won't do anything. Like, your opponent will have removal spells lying around, they'll be able to trade with them because you'll be pushed into your side. And in fact, even decks that don't rely on minions but don't play any, like Artifact High, do struggle with this. Like with Artifact High, the strategy is usually just to run into a corner and try and set up as quickly as possible. Decks like 8 Gates, they don't play many minions, but they still play them because it's helpful to have speed bumps that can also kill things. And these benefit from Songhai's very efficient AoE when you play Crescent Spear. So, although it is possible to build a deck that doesn't rely on minions, they still suffer for it. And even the ones that work are like very difficult to play because you're so vulnerable, right? You're always just backed into a corner. Like, people will play a lot of cards like Mistwalking and Silhouette Tracer just so they can buy another couple of turns of, like, running away, getting more mana. And so if you don't draw these cards and your opponent pins you in place, you just die. And which makes them even more difficult to play. You have to ration your resources very well. So in general, Duelists' kind of core mechanics very strongly support getting ahead on board, pressuring your opponent, and trying to take tempo, trying to be aggressive. And so hence the title of this video, the best defense is a good offense, right? If you're trying to play a long game defensive control deck, you're still pretty well served by getting up in your opponent's grill, pushing them into their side of the board, and trying to keep them off balance. And that lets you get to your late game naturally by just having minions that can hit their stuff. You don't have to worry about defending yourself and healing and defending yourself. You can just try and seize the board early or seize the board in the mid game. Like if you're playing Keep of Arth, a big part of their deck's strength is being able to make a massive tempo play with the Keeper that makes your opponent fall behind. So you kind of struggle for a bit and then you're like, bam, huge tempo play. And now you're ahead again. If you do want to go outside this, like if you want to build a control deck that's very heavy on spells, make sure it has a lot of generic answers, a lot of card draw so you can keep up with your opponent's value, a lot of healing. But so much of this is easier to do with just like playing random dudes and letting them help you trade. And once you're doing that, it becomes easier to trade and to defend yourself by being aggressive, by pushing yourself into your opponent's side of the board. So I think this isn't like a criticism of the game or anything, far from it. I think this element is actually pretty interesting, and I think in Gauntlet, this is very, very important and a lot of fun. Like I've waxed lyrical many times about the power of Frostfire in Draft. Frostfire is great because you can go turn 1 Crystal Cloaker, turn 2, now it's a 7/6, hit you in the face for 7. Even if the rest of your hand is like removal, card draw, big minions, that's still really good. Because now, A, your opponent loses a chunk of life, which makes it much easier to race them down or burst them down later. Which in turn means they have to play more defensively. B, they now have to respond to this threat, which eats up their mana, possibly deals them more damage, probably trades with something. C, they can't just kind of run at you and do the same thing right back, right? You just hit them for 7 and you still have a 7/4 in play. They're forced to retreat, they're forced to deal with it, and now you've made a heavy, impactful presence on the board and advanced into your opponent's territory and then forced them to turn around and deal with this thing, which allows you to snowball that advantage next turn. So even if you do that and then you just sit there and you develop like a Hailstone Golem into a Necroseer or something, like these big minions that are good at trading and good at getting value, your opponent's kind of gonna, for the rest of the game, is going to struggle under the momentum boost of that early massive hit. And so things like that can be very, very effective even in relatively mid-rangey or controlling draft decks. As an early play, it's so impactful. Like Dunecaster gets a similar benefit. Things like Scion's Second Wish, even. Like you buff a random 2 or 3 drop and you hit your opponent in the face, and now they have to deal with this massive thing that's threatening to put them close to lethal in a turn or two. Because it's very easy to go from, like if you're incautious, you stay near your opponent's stuff, it's very easy to go from like 20 life to dead in a couple of turns. Because random minions stack up in this game and they can add a lot of damage to the table. Sometimes you look at you miss. It's really easy to miss lethal because your opponent's on like 15 and you're just sitting there trading with their stuff, and you've got enough drag left behind from all this trading you've been doing that suddenly you can just turn it on their face. And the thing is that duelist players know this, right? We know this. You've been there, right? You've sat there and had your opponent just like, well, I couldn't really kill the things. They played a provoke, so I couldn't run away. And now I'm just going to take 10. Oh, they've drawn a thumping wave. I take 15. I guess that means I die. Like, most of us have been in that situation. And so it really is important to have that room to run away. When your opponent manages to like get in a burst of damage on you, it's really valuable to be able to say, okay, I'm on like 12, I'm in the danger zone, I'm getting out of here. I'm not going to trade any more damage. And so you run away. And it's much easier to run away if you pressured them in the first place and you're in their half of the board. And so in your control deck, where you might need to run away to preserve your life total and buy time to find your win cons, or in a combo deck where you might need to run away to preserve your life total and buy time to find your win cons, it's still better to try and get ahead in the early game, to try and push. And this is a bit at odds with, I made another video called the downside of 2-drops, which talked about how having 2-drops in your deck is kind of a cost, because you'll draw them later on, they won't do anything. But this is why people play them, right? Why it's so sad to miss your turn 1 play, because you fall behind so far when you don't get to play anything on turn 1, because now your opponent has free reign to just run into your hearth. And it makes all your cards worse for the rest of the game unless you can get out of it. And it's harder to get out of it because you're in it in the first place. And all your cards are worse. And it's exactly the same thing if you can do the opposite. If you can get ahead early on board, pressure your opponent into their side, all your cards are better, all their cards are worse. In a similar way to being better at positioning in general, like as a skill, if you're more skillful on positioning than your opponent, then your cards are like some measurable amount better than theirs by default, because a card in the wrong square is worse. You know, if you had like a numerical scale of percent of like how amazing this card is, a card on the wrong tile is worse than a card on the right tile. And so if you're more likely to put cards on the right tile, assuming there is a right, then your cards will be better on that same scale than your opponent's. And in exactly the same way, like, or indeed it ties into it, you know, if you can push your opponent into their half of the board, then you have more options for placing things on the right tile. You have more tiles to place things on, so you have access to choices your opponent can't make. And on average, that makes your cards better, because sometimes one of those choices will be the best one, or the second best one, or, you know, will dovetail nicely with your strategy, because ranking things by objective quality isn't very useful. But, you know, as an illustrative point, like, you'll have access to options, which means some of them will be just better than anything your opponent can possibly do in certain situations, which in turn makes your cards better. And so if you're playing a mid-range or control deck, they thrive on high card quality. And so your cards are better if you're in their face. So this video is already pretty long. We went through an example of how the Magma deck worked, and I touched briefly on a couple of other decks, but roughly how to implement this: make sure you're putting a decent number of high value 2 and 3 drops in your control decks. Try and find ones that actually fit with your strategy. Like Cryptographer in Varth is great because even later on it buffs your Varth. Early on it's small, but it has a persistent effect that helps you get value. You know, things like Circulus or As a Herald in Vanor decks can have utility in the mid to late game as well as being useful in someone. Blood Tier Alchemist, another good example. Make sure that you're running enough of this stuff and run card draw that helps you overcome the fact that you have these crappy 2-drops in your deck. None of this is a massive surprise. You know, this is pretty commonly understood in Duelist, right? You need 2-drops in your deck. So the real change comes with how you play. In Duelist, in general, unless you're playing a very specific deck, try and always think about how can I force myself on my opponent? How can I push the game into their half of the board? How can I limit their options? How can I cut them off, block them into a corner? How can I dominate this board, take territory? So try and be more aggressive than you normally would. If that includes allowing your opponent to make a trade on a minion, maybe that's fine, right? If it's not a particularly important minion, or especially if it already got some value, sometimes that's okay. It means positioning forward with your general. Your general is an immovable object, you know? Apart from Mesmerize, which no one plays. Your general is, usually speaking, an immovable object, and so they can kind of project onto a tile and say, this right here, I'm staying here, I'm not moving. Your opponent has to work around that. So where the 2 generals are defines kind of a battle line between the 2 forces that I actually went into in depth on some of my 9 Moons articles, if you want more on this. But that battle line, you want their half of it, their side of it, to be as small as possible to limit their options for where they can play things safely, where they can play things that aren't just going to get pounced on by your minions, or easily outmaneuvered or cut off. Positioning forward lets you make better use of trading in general, so it makes cards like Thunderhorn better. So if you're moving on this plan, you can play cards like Thunderhorn more easily, because the more options you have for where to place a Thunderhorn safely, and the more likely it is to be able to attack, the more likely you are to get use of its insane trigger. Yeah, that's about it. Play 2-drops, play aggressively. Don't think that just because you're playing control means you have to run away and be reactive. It's much better to be proactive, to set yourself up to have that chance to run away. And it's much better to be proactive, to deny your opponent the chance to make decisions that make your life difficult. So I think that about wraps this up. I hope I did a decent job of explaining that. I'm a little tired, so it might have been slightly incoherent. But as always, I'm happy to answer questions on it. And I think this is a very interesting topic, so maybe I'll revisit it at some point and look at some different details of it. But yeah, go face, or at least get in their face. Be aggressive. Do it. And I will see you next time.